I am so happy to welcome you to today's program. Circumstances prevent us from gathering, but technology allows us to broadcast this program in real time while keeping us all safe. Although we will not be able to have a Q&A session after the talk today, you can send your questions to the email address you'll see at the end of the program, and our speaker will do his best to answer them. We are grateful to everyone, especially our staff, who have made this virtual program happen. You will receive a link to the Women's Club's Facebook and YouTube pages update, where you'll be able to share and watch this program. I'm really looking forward to seeing you all again. We are anxious to return to our regular activities when it is safe to do so. Meanwhile, keep up with the club through our emails and follow us on social media. Now, Marjorie Greer, our speaker chair, will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Margaret. Today's speaker has a varied and stellar background. He has degrees in horticulture, Japanese language, and psychology. His studies include a year at Waseda University in Tokyo. For more than 2 decades, he was the award-winning executive director and later president and CEO of Richmond's Louis Ginter Botanical Garden. Under his leadership, the Botanical Garden grew to become one of the major horticultural and botanical facilities in the United States. The garden has been acknowledged in popular media as one of the top 10 public gardens in the US, and it is one of only 3 to receive the prestigious National Medal from the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences. Our speaker's professional achievements were recognized by the Garden Club of America when they awarded him the Zone Horticultural Commendation. He's been sought after as a consultant for projects as varied as the Healing Garden at Virginia Commonwealth University's Massey Cancer Center and landscape review for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Our speaker enjoys travel and has led horticultural tours throughout the United States, Western Europe, Argentina, and of course, Japan. The late physician and author Oliver Sacks said, "I cannot say exactly how nature exerts its calming and organizing effects on our brains, but I have seen in my patients the restorative and healing powers of nature and gardens. In many cases, gardens and nature are more powerful than any medication." How very welcome in this time of pandemic to hear about Japanese gardens as places to be experienced as pleasure and reflection, delight for the senses, and opportunities for meditation. And I can think of no better speaker than Frank Robinson as he explores Japanese gardens, oases for spirit and beauty. Frank Robinson.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Marjorie. I'm delighted to be here today. And I want to thank the audience for joining us in this new format. I think it might be a new way to interact over the next several weeks or months. As a way of introduction, I just would like to say I first went to Japan when I was 17 as a high school exchange student. I fell in love with the country, but one of my strongest first impressions was the importance of beauty and aesthetics in that culture. And I've been back many, many times over the last 50 years and can never get enough, but I always discover something new in the process. So let's begin the program. I'd like to start by talking about spirit, not so much about religion specifically, but about the 2 major belief systems that underlie the way the Japanese perceive and respond to beauty and to the natural world. I think these influence their garden design and their valuing of gardens as well. These are Shinto and Buddhism, completely different origins, but strangely complementary. Shinto is an indigenous religion of Japan, appropriate to an agrarian society. It sees the world as alive and animated by spirits called kami. Life is an experience of awe. And as you see in the top of the page, a joyously exuberant view of the world. I begin with this print by Namiki because it reflects the details and character of this magnificent tree, while also feeling otherworldly, given the brilliant reds and the glowing gold background. I suggest to you that the drawing of this tree reflects a Shinto view of nature, a celebration of the tree, its complexity, its beauty, its unique qualities, and its wildly dynamic. Kami occupy trees, rocks, wind, flowers, any element of nature worthy of awe. In Japan, there is a reverence for things which are old and venerable. They are seen as objects worthy as a place for kami to occupy. The shimenawa, these ropes tied around this tree and this rock with paper hanging from them, are intended to draw our attention to their magnificence and to make the sacred manifest. Buddhism, on the other hand, came to Japan from India via China in the 7th century. Buddhism generally sees life as suffering, and it emphasizes a focus on the afterlife, when we will leave the suffering of this world. This is an image of Kannon, the goddess of mercy. She watches over mankind to relieve their suffering, and to do so, she has 11 heads with which to observe and 1,000 arms with which to assist. But there is so much suffering that she also has 1,000 assistants to help her intervene and minimize the pain of life. But Buddhism also stresses the ephemeral nature of life, that we can tolerate the suffering because life passes so quickly, and therefore we should be in the moment. The past is gone, the future doesn't yet exist, and so we should savor the current reality that we have. As we view the gardens, I hope you will think about these dynamics, the Shinto sense of awe and exuberance for life, the Buddhist aspiration for an ideal perfection beyond this world, and its emphasis on being present in the moment. This is Mira Shigemori, who was one of the most outstanding 20th century garden designers in Japan. He was trained as a young man as a classicist in ikebana, tea ceremony, and Japanese painting. In 1917, he entered the prestigious Tokyo Institute of Fine Arts to become a painter, but he determined after being there that he wasn't as talented naturally as other members of his class. And so he studied art history with an emphasis in Japanese art history. In 1923, he returned home and he published a number of scholarly texts, including one on the philosophy of sex, which made him an independently wealthy man. In 1934, a powerful typhoon hit Japan and did major damage to historic gardens from the 12th and 13th century. Shigemori realized that there was no documentation for many of these ancient gardens, and he had concern that precious history and part of the Japanese culture could be lost. So he set out to carefully document over 350 major gardens throughout the country, the first ever such effort. It resulted in an 8,000-page manuscript, which is still a seminal source for information on garden history and garden design in Japan. However, through this effort, he concluded that many of the gardens had become meaningless copies of other previous gardens, and they had lost their spiritual and artistic essence. In 1939, the abbot of Tofukuji Temple in Kyoto asked Shigemori to redesign gardens around the abbot's quarters, the inner sanctum of the temple where monks were trained, but they were in financial distress. Shigemori agreed to design the garden at no cost, but he demanded full artistic license. He completed the project, but he was immediately labeled a rebel and a radical by traditionalists. Yet he spent the rest of his life as a garden designer, completing over 200 installations. Tofukuji is considered his masterpiece. This garden was completed in 1939, and Shigemori declared that the gardens must be works of art, not just landscapes. They must reconnect with their Japaneseness, and they must again become the realm of the kami. Even though this is a Buddhist temple, what he intended was the design elements in the garden would be worthy of the kami becoming present. Kami are universal and not concerned with religious doctrine. This is the South Garden, and in many ways, it is typical of the dry landscape gardens of Japan, consisting primarily of rocks and gravel. This rock cluster represents Horai, the mythical island occupied by the 8 immortals, who are spirits who have transcended the limits of humanity and know the secrets of nature. The idea is similar to the Isles of the Blessed in Celtic tradition and the Elysian fields of the Greeks. He also created this very complex gravel pattern to represent the 8 great seas, which have to be crossed to reach Horai. Immortals flew on the backs of cranes, but mere humans would have to sail through treacherous waters and dangerous whirlpools. What's unusual about this garden is that the large stones to the left are very jagged, and there's major contrast between the vertical forms and the horizontal ones. And also, there's a wide variation in color in the large rocks, and the complexity and vigorousness of the gravel pattern was quite unusual. On the right, you'll see an image of the Zen garden at Ryoanji Temple, one of the most famous gardens in Japan. You'll see the rocks there are more uniform in size and color, not nearly as dramatic, and the gravel pattern is much, much more simple. These gardens were intended to challenge the mind, although we think of them as meditation gardens. The Buddhists believe that thought and language are impediments to enlightenment. And so once the mind is exhausted, it becomes an empty vessel for enlightenment. People like to put literal interpretations of what these gardens are about. The Ryoanji garden on the right often is described as islands in the middle of the ocean, or the peaks of mountains poking out from the fog, or even mother tiger guiding her cubs across a lake. But in truth, it's about challenging one's perception of the universe. There are 15 rocks in this garden, but from any vantage point, one can only see 14. So if you could shift to the left by 3 feet or shift to the right by 3 feet, and the reality you see before you changes, it then leads to the questions about what don't we understand about the greater world, what's hidden from us, and then beyond to the universe itself. This is the North Garden, and it's made from a checkerboard pattern of cut stone and moss. What was unusual about this garden is that natural forms were traditionally used in Japanese gardens. And so by using these flat, square stones, it was considered very innovative and perhaps inappropriate. Also, the stark contrast between the hard rock and the soft moss was considered too much. What's Japanese and spiritual about it, however, is this checkerboard pattern called ichimatsu in Japanese has long been used in Japanese aesthetic. And what you can't see is to the left of the garden is a famous ravine of Japanese maples. And Shigemori said the pattern of the stone in this garden reminded him of the red leaves that would blow into the garden in the fall as their maples started to lose leaves. And then ultimately the wind would take them and they would disappear altogether in the garden. Very similar to the transient nature of life. In the East Garden, you see the Big Dipper, Ursa Major. And this is taken from the side so you have to twist your head a little bit to the right to really see it well. But to the rear is the handle of the dipper, and in front of us is the larger part of the dipper itself. This was the first time a constellation was ever represented in a Japanese garden, and Shigemori made it from the bollards that supported an old outhouse. He said this because he wanted to remind the monks that they should be both frugal and humble. What's Japanese and spiritual about this is that both in Shinto and Buddhism, purification is an important aspect of spiritual preparation. Before entering a holy place, tradition was one would wash one's hands and one's mouth. This act is repeated again before entering the inner sanctum of the abbot's quarters, so the dipper symbolizes and reinforces the importance of spiritual preparedness. We're now looking at an image of Ginkakuji, the silver pavilion in Kyoto. It's a garden of retreat and inspiration. It was built by Ashikaga Yoshimasa, who at the time, in the late 1400s, was shogun, the ultimate military leader. But it was a period of terrible civil war, and he tired of battle, and so he abdicated his position and built the silver pavilion as his retreat to pursue his interest in the arts. He had tremendous influence on what we know today as Japanese arts, architecture, and cultural traditions. Tea ceremony had its origins in the silver pavilion, as well as ikebana, ink painting, shoin zukuri architecture, and no theater, all advanced by Yoshimasa and his interest. This is a typical stroll garden from this era. It's built around a central pond surrounded by walking paths. There are several small islands in the pond connected by bridges, and there's an upper garden of moss. Yoshimasa's grandfather built the famous Golden Pavilion, and it's believed he fully intended to cover the main structure that you see here at the left in silver leaf. He either ran out of funds or never completed the project before his death. This type of garden is often associated with Pure Land Buddhism, which came to Japan in the late 12th century. Pure Land became the Buddhism of the common man versus the disciplined, ascetic, meditative practices of Zen and other Buddhist sects. Pure Land emphasized mindfulness of the Buddha. And if you were to chant Namu Amida Butsu at your death, you would enter the Pure Land, a place of great beauty inhabited by gods, men, flowers, fruits, rare birds, and wish-granting trees. This was a way station to nirvana, where you would be instructed by Buddha in how to reach full enlightenment. And beautiful stroll gardens were designed to represent Pure Land on the earth. If we shift slightly, we see a dramatic cone of white gravel next to a distinctive bed of raked gravel. Generally, this cone is believed to represent Mount Fuji, and the raked gravel, rough waves, and the ocean, neither of which are close to Kyoto. This was probably added in the 17th century, as there's no mention in earlier histories of the garden. There are many references to the moon in the design and history of this complex. The moon rises between two mountain peaks visible from the southeast corner of the main hall. And there's mention in literature that the moon can be seen washing itself, reflected in the waterfall farther north in the garden. The cone is also known as a moon viewing platform. Moon viewing parties were important social events in this era for aristocrats, and full moon days were significant for Buddhist religious practices, as major events in Buddha's life were attributed to full moon days. The pure, soft light of the moon has been an enduring symbol in Buddhism for truth and enlightenment. And one can't help but think that the reflection of the full moon on the flat top of the moon viewing platform, the additional dramatic light and shadow of the wave patterns, and the potential reflection of moonlight off the silver leaf of the pavilion would not have made this an enrapturing experience into a heavenly realm. Shake is the idea of borrowed landscape, and it's a unique element in landscape design in Japan. This is achieved by framing and incorporating natural landscapes from beyond the garden at hand, greatly extending its perception of depth and size. This is a modest little garden composed primarily of azaleas backed by a hedge, but the borrowed landscape of the valley, its blooming cherry trees, and the mountains beyond transform it into something much more grand and interesting. This garden is in Shinto Temple in Kyoto, and it uses borrowed landscape very dramatically. Shinto was built in 1693, and this is a relatively small garden, but the use of borrowed landscape is very, very significant in interpreting its art treasure from 1709, which I'll show you in just a couple of minutes. Another view, and you can see the mountains beyond and how they really add to the depth and dimension of this garden. The art treasure is the death of Buddha, and it shows Buddha laid out on a dais surrounded by sal trees. And from every corner of the world, men of wealth and poverty have come to mourn the death of Buddha, as well as mankind, all kinds of animals from every corner of the earth, elephants, tigers, lions, horses, rats, and snakes. You see them prostrate in the foreground of the picture. But what these mourners don't understand is from out yonder, from those mountains beyond the garden that we're interpreting here, is Buddha's mother and a band of musicians who have come to lead him back into nirvana. And the message here is not to mourn that death is a transition, is a passage to a greater, more wonderful existence. And please note the full moon that exists up in the very top of this image. And here's the work of art in the garden side by side. You can see the vertical form, or the horizontal forms represent the body of Buddha, and the various rocks in the foreground represents the mourners. This is the Adachi Museum and Garden. You can see I arrived on a very rainy day. It was founded in 1970 by Adachi Zenko, who grew up on Japan's western coast in the early 20th century. His family were poor farmers, and he resolved in his youth that he would be a merchant one day and make money. At 14, he began hauling coal by a hand cart from Yasugi, his hometown, to Matsue on the coast, 15 miles away. Eventually, he became a textile wholesaler, a rice merchant, and was active in real estate in Osaka. And in the process, he became a very wealthy man. He loved art from an early age, and he began collecting early and mid-century Japanese paintings, assembling over 1,500 masterpieces in his collection. In addition, he loved Japanese gardens. So at the age of 71, he determined to build a museum and a significant garden in his hometown. He believed that gardens were living paintings, changing through the day and through each season, always different and unique. He built 6 gardens around his museum, but they can only be viewed. You cannot enter them. From plate glass windows, such as you see here, or from small outside verandas. He hoped this approach would harmonize the two mediums of visual art and of garden art and create an excitement of beauty for the visitor. Every element of this garden was selected like a jewel in one's private collection. Each rock, Each tree was hand-selected from around Japan, brought to the site, and installed. Adachi had a great deal of influence over the design of this garden, but he worked with another noted 20th century design master named Nakane Kinsaku. The garden scale is huge. It takes 30 gardeners on a daily basis to keep it up. And there are 7 full-time pruners who care for the trees and the shrubs to keep them in perfect form. And they have a very effective use of borrowed landscape, as you see in this image, using the mountains behind to vastly extend this garden. It's quite beautiful, but I have to say I found it frustrating not to be able to go in and enjoy it in a 3-dimensional space. The garden has been named the best garden in Japan by the Journal of Japanese Gardens since 2003. I'd like to return to Tofukuji for a minute, because when I first went there, I found the gardens to be very powerful, but somehow very familiar. And I went back multiple times, and as I did, I felt it somehow had some hidden elements. If you remember, I said Shigemori said gardens had to be works of art. They had to return to their Japaneseness, and they had to become the realm of the kami. Also, that Shigemori studied art history. There is no scholarly research into what I'm going to suggest, only my own observation. But I think Tofukuji is a garden with hidden art. If this is true, it's quite astounding because it's completely counter to what Shigemori professed as his goal. But as you look at Van Gogh's Starry Night and you look at the South Garden representing Horai, the similarities are really quite striking. If we look at Mondrian's composition using his grids and the North Garden's design of the contrast of the stone and the moss, it makes one wonder. Shigemori wrote, as one of his scholarly texts, a book that was published called The Japanese History of the Unification of Opposites, while Mondrian in his art pursued the hidden unity of dynamic opposites. And here we see Van Gogh's Starry Night over the Rhone, as well as the Dipper represented at Tofukuji. And even the coloration of the stone reflect some of the coloration of Van Gogh's art. I have no idea if there's any association in truth. If it's true, it would be astounding because, as you probably know, Japanese art, particularly woodblock prints, had huge influence on the art of the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists in the late 19th century. Van Gogh had a large collection of woodblock prints, and Monet, Manet, Degas, Cassatt, Toulouse-Lautrec, to name a few, were all inspired by new ideas gleaned from Japanese art. It's intriguing, if nothing else. Now we're going to shift from formal gardens to the Japanese spring flower festivals. Throughout the country in the spring, there was an outpouring of people to these events and sites for the sheer pleasure of the seasons. Some are hosted by individual temples and shrines, other by private entities, and some by municipal parks, in the belief that beauty and being outdoors is good for the well-being of the citizenry. This slide is of Nezu Shrine in Tokyo. It has over 1,000 mature azaleas with more than 100 varieties. And if you can look at the line of people snaking from the right all the way up to the top, and then they continue back to the left of this image on a daily basis of traffic. It never stops, but people are truly thrilled to be in the midst of this spring beauty. This is Hitachi Seaside Park, a public park in Hitachi on the east coast, Pacific coast of Japan. Every spring, they take about 30 acres and they seed Nemophila, which is a low blue annual native to Western United States, and create this magnificent setting with pathways through to explore just a landscape that totally engulfs you with this soft blue color. And at the very top where you see people gathered is a view of the Pacific Ocean. It's really quite spectacular. And again, it draws tens of thousands of people every season. And this was an engagement photo that took place in at the tulip beds of that wonderful park as well. This is Ashikaga Flower Park, not far from Hitachi, in the northern part of Japan. This is a 150-year-old wisteria. I'm surprised it doesn't have shimenawa around it to recognize its auspiciousness, but it is truly magnificent, and it extends in all directions, so you can walk below it, and it is illuminated at night, which is a spectacular scene. Ashikaga has a huge collection of mature wisteria, and any color or any style of its use horticulturally is available to be experienced there. And again, quite stunning. This is Kawachi Wisteria Garden in Fukuoka on Kyushu in the south. And there's a bamboo farmer who also happens to love wisteria. He's created 2 tunnels the length of a football field, and he grows 20 to 30 varieties of wisteria over the tunnels, so people can walk through them and enjoy the blossoms as they hang down from overhead. And at the very top of his mountain, he's created this magnificent trellis covered in wisteria. It's like walking through a cloud. And the fragrance is extraordinary, and the tops or the bottoms of the blossoms sometimes just are long enough to tickle your head, and it really was an immersive experience of great beauty and delight. And this garden is in Matsue. It's a traditional Japanese garden on the west coast, not far from where Mr. Adachi built his garden. In the spring, they excavate parts of the garden and put in shallow pans of water. Matsue is the center for tree peony cultivation in Japan, and the local nurserymen cut flowers from their tree peony stock and bring it to Matsue, to this garden, to Yushien, and float these cut flowers in the garden for visitors to come and enjoy. And what you see here is the central pond of the garden that is completely covered in cut flower peonies. Over the 2-week period of this festival, over 1 million flowers are cut and put on display in this garden. And in the spring, when the natural Yoshino cherries bloom throughout the countryside in Japan, the wonderful 1,000-year-old tradition of hanami takes place. Every public park throughout the country is covered in pink. And the Japanese delight in the experience. I'd like to read you a piece that I picked up a few years ago when I was there at cherry blossom time. Cherries teach us the important lessons of life. They teach us hope and anticipation when we await their bloom. They teach us the beauty of life when they are in full flower. They remind us of the ephemeral nature of life as their delicate petals dance in the wind, and they flush with fresh green leaves. They assure us that a new cycle of life yet begins again. Cherries are living poetry. And we come to a final slide, which is another print by Namiki of a magnificent mature cherry tree. I hope the gardens we've seen today will spark some thoughts for you in your own gardens. Might they be more spiritual or inspirational or artful? I hope you'll think about ways in which they can be ever more meaningful to you than they might already be. But most of all, I hope that the program today will inspire you to be present in the moment, to aspire to something greater, and especially to find awe in all that is around you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Happy spring. Please stay safe and well. Thank you.